Hello, this is Russell Moore, and this is the audio version of the More to the Point newsletter. You can get the newsletter every week in your inbox by clicking on the link in the show notes. This week, I want to talk about why American Christians ought to care about Venezuelan gang members' deportation. Now, let me say this first. We ought to deport Venezuelan gang members and any other criminals who are illegally in this country. I don't think most American Christians object to that at all, and nor should they. We ought to realize that the basic biblical justification for the existence of a state includes the state's responsibility to uphold law and protect the citizenry. That's what the Apostle Paul is talking about in Romans 13, 1 through 5. And as Americans, we can see that our founders built into the constitutional republic that we're part of the means for the government to do just that, to see to it that the laws are faithfully executed. That means prosecuting dangerous criminals, and for those who are not supposed to be here, seeing to it that they are sent out of the country. The what of that kind of deportation shouldn't be in question, nor should the why, but we ought to recognize as Christians and as Americans that we also ought to care about the how. What alarmed me about the recent reports of sweeping deportations of alleged members of Venezuelan gangs is not that they're arrested, is not that they're deported, nor was it at first about the questions of due process for these alleged criminals. Law enforcement often is charged with violating due process in some way or another. Usually those charges are met with government agents arguing why, on the basis of the law, they think they have the right to act as they did. To some extent, that's what White House border czar Tom Homan did when reporters were asking him last week whether the executive branch has the powers they're claiming under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to deport these alleged offenders to an El Salvadoran prison. He said they do, and that he would fight for that right in court. Now, that's appropriate to say we've got a question on the table, we're going to take it to the courts. That's the kind of question that courts were meant to discern. But what concerned me was what Homan said next. To ABC News this week, Homan responded to a question about due process with these words. Due process? What was Laken Riley's due process? What were all these young women that were killed and raped by members of TDA, the Venezuelan gang? What was their due process? How about the young lady that was burned alive on the subway? Where was her due process? Now, Laken Riley was a nursing student who was murdered by an immigrant here illegally. The cases that Holman mentioned are all criminal and should be morally outrageous to any functioning conscience. The rhetoric that he's using here, though, confuses categories in ways that could have implications for much, much bigger questions about the size and scope of the state. If your neighbor is apprehended by police because she's running a meth lab in her basement, that's a good thing. You don't want to live in a society where laws against drug running are ignored by authorities. You don't want your house to catch fire should the neighbor's meth lab explode. And unless you're watching a rerun episode of Breaking Bad, you probably don't have any sympathy for meth dealers, and nor should you. But what if your neighbor's meth lab is found not because someone suspects criminal activity, followed by a legal investigation of it and a warrant, but by the fact that every house is surveilled by the government? That kind of surveillance is going to come up with some legitimate bad actors because it's looking at everybody, as the Constitution forbids. Now, if you said that unlawful spying without a warrant is wrong, imagine that somebody says back to you, well, what about the meth dealers we arrested? Are you pro-meth? Of course not. You're not pro-meth. You're not pro-murder. Your objection to a police state would be an objection to the government not following the law, even if the government's law breaking sometimes led to some good results. Now, in that, you'd be recognizing some of the best aspects of liberal democracy. Small l, small d. The idea that a people must give attention not just to lawful ends, but also to lawful means. That what matters is not just what the results are that we get, but how we get to them. Now, this is something I think a lot of us take for granted in a system that we've always been a part of. Some, such as journalist and author Jonah Goldberg, have argued for years what I think is right, that we ought to recognize what a miracle this kind of project is. A nation that operates not out of bonds of tribal loyalty, but according to a system of laws that are accountable to the people. And not just that, a system that protects the rights even of the minority when the Democratic majority, small d, wants to oppress them. One very secular proponent of liberal democracy and constitutional republicanism argues that this miracle can be traced to at least one unlikely source: Calvinism. Francis Fukuyama writes that most of his fellow secularists discount the importance of the Protestant Reformation in the emergence of the modern state, and that the Lutheran and Calvinist wings of the Reformation both contributed in different ways to the kind of order that we take for granted. Lutheranism added fire to the energy for mass literacy necessary for this kind of order by encouraging the reading of the Bible by the laity. But Fukuyama says this: the Calvinist wing was really important in getting rid of corruption because there's a kind of austere personal morality that was cultivated in the Calvinist tradition, which was important in the founding of modern bureaucracies in the Netherlands, in Prussia, in England, and in the United States. Fukuyama was not suggesting that Calvinism itself was democratic or liberal in the sense that we think of modern governments being. My Anabaptist ancestors, as they were fleeing Switzerland under the threat of drowning by Calvinist magistrates because they refused to baptize their babies, they would know that, as would Michael Servetus when he was being led to the pyre for heresy. What Fukuyama is arguing, though, is that the kind of personal morality Calvinism emphasized led ultimately to something unnatural, an impersonal state. So Fukuyama says this, quote, "I think in the end that corruption is a very natural thing. You want to help your friends and you want to help your family. This idea that you should be impersonal and not steal on behalf of your friends or your family doesn't occur to anyone unless they're forced to do it. Calvinism imposes a kind of morality on its believers that was conducive to a strict order in which you could tell bureaucrats that this is really wrong. Unless you internalize those rules, no amount of external surveillance is going to be able to make people really honest," end quote. Fukuyama's partly right. The so-called friend-enemy distinction is indeed natural in terms of nature as we know it in this fallen universe east of Eden. That's why if we base our ethics or our politics or our culture on nature, we will end up with something akin to the law of the jungle. Those with the most guns or tanks win, everyone else is subjugated. That leads, by definition, to an unlimited and unrestricted state. It leads, and usually quickly, to a rule by bribery and intimidation in which criminality is defined, not by what one does, but by who one knows. Only if one thinks there's something to which even the state is ultimately accountable, to a moral order that's about more than just who has the most votes, can one have a state that is in any way limited. As Americans, we ought to care about the how and not just the what of any government action because we believe that there's a constitution by which even the most popular notion must be constrained. But as Christians, we ought to care about the means as well as the ends because we believe that rendering unto Caesar does not include recognizing Caesar as God. Venezuelan gangsters, Danish money launderers, Romanian human traffickers, we should prosecute all of them and remove from the country anybody who's here illegally doing that kind of criminal activity. But we ought to care how we do it. There's due process. A liberal democracy slows down a lot of things we might like to do, but we will miss it when it's gone. The rule of law is fallible, but it's a good idea, one that we cannot afford to deport. This is the audio version of the More to the Point newsletter. Sign up in the show notes to get it in your inbox every Wednesday. This is Russell Moore.